Good evening. My name is Zahera Harb. I'm the director of MA International Journalism at City University of London, a former journalist from Lebanon. And I will be moderating the discussion of this very powerful film. With me is Mustafa Qadiri. Mustafa is Executive Director of Equidom Research and Consulting, a specialist human rights and labor rights organization. Jess Kelly, the director and narrator of the film, and Owen Penal, the producer of the film. Let me just start with you, Owen. How did you get the story?
Well, it started as a tip-off from an activist who is from Kuwait, and she was talking about how perceptions have changed since they brought in a new law in 2015, but how equally, while things seem to be changing for the better, there were trends which seemed to be undermining those changes, and one of those things was the growth of these online sales. And she pointed to the way that Instagram was being used increasingly to buy and sell domestic workers. And she told us the hashtag, and we just spent a couple of weeks kind of looking at all the different results that came up when you typed in that hashtag to various different apps. And we found thousands of adverts for domestic workers in Kuwait and in Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region.
Jess, if I want just to be the devil's advocate here, these are applications. How could the companies that actually host these applications be able to verify what's on those applications?
Well, Apple and Google are obviously multi-billion-dollar companies. They definitely have the resources and the manpower to police what's on their app stores, and their own guidelines boast about very stringent app review processes. Apple says what's on our app store says a lot about who we are. And among those things are obviously that human trafficking, modern slavery shouldn't have any presence on their platforms, and nor should discrimination, religious discrimination or gender or anything like that have a presence. So every time a developer wants to upload an app, the teams at Apple or Google will have a look at that app and see whether it contravenes any of their guidelines or local law or international law, and if it does, it shouldn't be uploaded. And beyond that, once an app is live, there's an app review process. They boast about how often they look through apps and reassess whether they're still obeying the guidelines and international laws and local laws. So to be honest, I don't know how this could have fallen through the cracks in terms of how rigorous they say that their review processes are. It's unbelievable that with the amount of money and resources they have, that they couldn't police this. And I mean that's just kind of that they should, and it's possible. But obviously they are, under international law, they actually have to as well. And in Australia and the UK, they have to abide by the Modern Slavery Act.
What was their reaction? It seems that they are only in a position to actually react rather than act.
Yeah.
So, but we didn't really get a sense of, especially from Apple and Google, did they do anything except the fact that they issued these statements?
No, I mean, to be honest, the only positive reaction we really had was from Instagram, from Facebook, who removed a lot of hashtags and a lot of accounts. But these were only the accounts that we supplied them with. We gave them some of our evidence. But Google and Apple really haven't done anything apart from to say that they condemn these practices on their platforms. And, we have seen them take down other apps in the past, like the Hong Kong protest apps. They are very, they can be reactive if it's in their interest. China is a huge part of their business, and that's obviously why they deemed it right to take down that app. But in this case, if nobody is looking at what's going on in their apps, it seems like they're not going to waste money on policing them.
It's a question of whose responsibility is it? Is it the government's responsibility or the tech giants' responsibility? But we'll get to that. Mustafa, can you just give us a brief of what is the Kafala system? What does it mean? How does it work? Why?
Yeah, sure. I'm not sure. Is this on?
Yeah.
So Kafala is a very general term for the work visa system in most of the Gulf and the Middle East. That Kafala basically means sponsorship. Kafil is your sponsor. Now, there are differences between different countries, but the fundamental premise of it is that when you look for a job as a foreigner in a place like Kuwait, you need to have someone who's a national or a resident of that country or a company to effectively give you that sponsorship, and they're also your employer. So what that means is that person not only is giving you a job, they have profound power over your life there. So when it comes to you registering your documents, whether you can leave the country, whether you can find another employer, and then there's other things, basically social forms of control, which are part of kafala and the unwritten, so the non-legal aspect of it. So for example, there's an expectation that if I have someone working as a domestic worker, that, as you saw in this documentary, that person is literally my product. And I can trade that person, I can treat them the way that I want. And the situation is complicated by a couple of other factors. One, that it is literally a crime to run away from your employer in Kuwait and other Gulf countries. So there's so many situations, as you see in this powerful documentary, and that we see all the time, where a worker leaves an abusive situation, they go to the police and they actually get prosecuted because they've run away from their employer. It's very easy for employers to complain in response to a complaint from an employee that the person has run away. So that fundamentally is kafala, and the most shocking thing is that the legal system in Kuwait is probably the most progressive, and that's a positive thing. The Kuwaiti government, legislators, and the parliament have actually tried to reform their system. It's the first country in the Gulf, incredibly, to actually put legal protections for domestic workers, give them a day off. And despite that, as you see in this documentary, I'm seeing it for the first time, and the fact that a police officer is one of the people selling shows you the depth of that problem.
Yeah, but it comes also with what the lawyer said, the fact that they actually don't realize themselves that they're doing something that is, first of all, illegal and inhumane. You know, it's the idea that it's normal for them.
I think there's so many factors to this. Obviously racism plays a role, the power dynamic, gender plays a role. Another thing is also that to think about is in the private space there is a real concept that this is my domain, that the law, the rules don't really apply. This is my place and I can control that. And the other thing to think about, and in no way an excuse, it's just to give a bit of context, is that Kuwait is a relatively more free Gulf state, but these are repressive societies where nationals don't actually have many rights. So the state, effectively, part of the social contract is we don't give you civil political rights. If you're a woman in Kuwait or in the Gulf countries, you have very little rights as well. So we give you rights over someone else. And I think often the reflection of this sort of repressive and oppressive behavior, it's a reflection of the lack of powers that these people have. And it's a way for also people to make profit, to exploit others, because they themselves don't have many freedoms. And that sort of plays into it. Anyone who's campaigning for the freedoms for these people will often find, as we do, and people talked about in the documentary, that locals will complain, well, hang on, why are you so, and it's not actually unusual also in the UK in a less extreme form, but why are you so worried about migrants and these sort of, backward, uneducated people? What about me?
Yeah.
And this
but
is a huge challenge we have to face.
Just to say that Kuwait has one of the highest level of liberal, women rights in the region, so in the Gulf region, just not to,
absolutely, which is a real positive. But my point just to say that these are the sort of challenges that we have to face, and that's absolutely right, and that's a very positive thing that you have that in Kuwait. Yeah.
Let me go back to Jess, and one thing that actually kind of like question in my head is, how come Anne is still in Kuwait? Do you have an answer for that? Or
Yeah, Anne has some protection because she's now married to a Kuwaiti national, and that's really what kind of solidified her position in Kuwait. And they've spent the last 10 years kind of growing from a very underground organisation where they used to kind of pick up pieces of paper from the road of domestic workers who are saying they're in distress and constantly in fear of being detected by the authorities, and actually growing into an organisation that's working with the government. And it's still a slightly precarious position, but she's ultimately protected insofar as she was willing to show her face in this film, and whereas some of her colleagues who don't have don't have that protection of the Kuwaiti citizenship, they weren't willing to be on camera. So it's unusual in a Gulf state to have for example, a Filipino former worker running an NGO that fights for domestic workers. That's not normal to have in the region.
But also it tells you, the fact that Kuwait has a very vibrant trade union sector, which also helps in that aspect. If we just want to go back to the idea of that you've actually interfered and did your best to help Fatou, which is something that usually does not take place in a documentary film setting. Broadcasters have rules, and to a certain extent you actually broke those rules by interfering and helping, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
But can you just tell us a little more about that?
Well, I think that at the BBC especially, there's a lot of due diligence that we have to do when we do anything. The undercover phone calls that we did, we had to go through a lot of hoops to be able to do them. But obviously it unearthed some cases that we weren't really expecting, and some abuses that we weren't expecting on a level beyond what we expected. So finding a child being offered for sale was something which we weren't thinking would happen, and at that point we did kind of talk to other people within the organisation, and it was basically thought that we did have a duty to protect in the case of a child. And to alert authorities was the kind of first thing. That's in the UK, you'd normally just go to the authorities, but in Kuwait we first went and sought the advice of Anne and some other people within the kind of civil society in Kuwait, because we wanted to find out what the best course of action would be, and they said that actually often when you report these cases, the women or the children in this case can get into trouble and be arrested because she might be accused of working illegally and put in jail, and Kuwaiti jail is not a good place for domestic workers to be. So we went through a much longer process of kind of following Anne as she tried to seek find the domestic worker in her where she was currently living. But it, as you saw in the film, it kind of proved to be impossible, because once you get sold on one of these apps, you're kind of lost in the system. And I think the pressure of having the cameras there meant that the Kuwaiti government reacted a lot faster than they would normally react. Anne even said, this wouldn't normally happen, that the domestic worker would just be smoothly found and then smoothly taken to the shelter and then sent back home, which was her her wish.
So did you feel that the power of the camera, that the camera actually was there, helped you in sorting out, or
Yeah, definitely. And we had plenty of off-camera chats with other people in the domestic workers section of the government who were kind of very aware of what we were doing, kind of wanted to help insofar as it would make them look good, and were constantly asking us, like, you're going to portray Kuwait in a bad light. So we were definitely aware that this wasn't a normal course of action. A lot of the domestic workers, like in the shelter you saw, they spent months and months and months there, and that's the best place they could end up. Often they would be in prison. So we were really cautious at first. Firstly wanted to find out whether where she'd come from and why she'd got there. Who knows what she would be going back to. So it was a really difficult decision to make, as a journalist, whether it was the right thing to do. But we actually just spoke to Fatou today, and she's doing really well. She's living with her sister. She's back at school, and she has some financial stability. So
yeah, you've actually this GoFundMe Fatou.
Yeah.
You might want to shed light later on that campaign that is taking place. But Mustafa, is it that easy to transfer the kafala from one person to another?
What do you mean by that? Sorry.
I mean, if someone these people are saying,
Oh, I see
come
what you mean
and
transfer. Yeah. So this is the strange thing. So because it's a
it-
power.
I suppose that there should be paperwork involved.
I mean, so there would be paperwork, but so long as a no objection certificate is given by the current sponsor, then you can be transferred to another employer. But the point is, it's the employer, the sponsor, the same thing. It's for them to decide that. And if you think about it, if you're in a situation where you want to leave a job or whatever happens, you want to get imagine all of you who work. Imagine if you don't like your job and your employer knows that. That's an incredible trump card that they've got to try to influence you in some way. So yes, the system is actually very efficient when it comes to employers saying, I want to move this person on to someone else. But when it comes to the employee complaining about the conditions, it will criminalize them for running away. So yeah, no, it's very, very easy to do that.
Okay. Let me just open it for questions, and then I still have some questions, but let's engage the audience. Yes. Just 1 second, we're waiting for the microphone, please.
Really, it's not a question, it's a suggestion.
Just,
Sorry, 1 moment. Sorry.
yeah.
Sorry. I was going to say it's more than a question, is a suggestion that because of your interest in this horrible, immoral practice of slavery, you now go to Saudi Arabia and to Kuwait, you've been to Bahrain and to India and go to
I
Africa.
can't hear you. Can you just...
Where
Yeah.
where the same slavery exists all the time, and in the UK itself it happens. I remember a few years ago, an Indian temple was built beneath them, and they built it with slaves. They, instead of paying British salaries, they brought about 200 men from India, and they have them all sleeping 40 to a room, and they pay them £3 a day, and they just gave them the
Thank
food.
you. Actually,
So-
it's one of the things that Owen and Jess has been asked about, which basically is it's not something that is only specific to the Gulf.
Yeah.
It's a global.
That's right, yeah,
phenomenon.
including here in the UK. Yeah, I mean, one of the things, while we were making this documentary, we spoke to a domestic workers organisation here in London called Kalayan, and they talk about how the overseas domestic worker visa, which the UK has introduced in 2012 as part of the hostile environment policy, has actually resulted in similar kind of cases and has meant that a lot of domestic workers, many of whom are also employed by Gulf nationals who come to London or come to the UK, are treating their domestic workers in much the same way, and the visa restriction means that it's very difficult for those domestic workers to get their rights or to actually that they're in conditions of slavery.
There's the same
essentially.
law that they can't leave or change their employer while they're in the UK. So often they end up in prison here as well in the UK.
This is one of the dirty secrets, which is that this problem is very common here. I mean, there was a situation, you probably saw, a very famous one of these migrant workers found dead in a very big semi-trailer. It was a very big story, and there was a funeral for them. I mean, literally weeks later, a similar group was found in a semi-trailer, but they were alive. And the police were brought over to arrest them and to deport them as criminals, even though they had also been trafficked. So absolutely, in the UK, you have the same situation where victims of these kinds of treatment are actually criminalised. And after Brexit, with the rhetoric about ending immigration, particularly from EU, but with all these sectors of business saying that we are completely dependent on migrants, what we're going to likely see is high pressure to bring people in all sorts of informal ways, increasing the risk of trafficking and abuse. And in fact, when those victims come out, they will not be helped by the system. In fact, they get criminalized. So absolutely, it's a global phenomenon. Obviously, some extreme things happening in the Gulf, but absolutely, it's very common here in the UK as well.
Just like just one thing in Bahrain, they also removed the passport They have also the air companies or many companies. They have
Yeah, it's very common.
people from India, from Nepal, from
Yeah.
Sri Lanka, and they remove the passports, and they are all slaves.
Have question at the back. Yeah.
My name is Fudi, and congratulations for the documentary. I was wondering, you were just talking about the Saudi Arabia and the Kuwait, criminalizing immigrants and so on and so forth. I'm quite aware that the British government does criminalize people, particularly refugees or any kind of people that actually flee for the safety and security. What happened to them is basically they get to be dropped into a jail system. The government prefers to call it detention center. That's a prison. So we're having to do with a situation where people fleeing to seek refuge and protection, they get first to be seen with prosecution by this government. And I haven't seen that yet. Any media attention. Would you consider to show interest in this particular field and try to have a look of what's been going on?
I'm sorry, but there have been media attention. There has been work done on this specific issue. I think Channel 4 actually did some good work on women detention center, refugee women detention center, and how they've been treated on first arrival. So, do you have anything to say? But I think this is something that has been looked. It needs more attention, but it's something that has been already in the public domain.
Yeah, I mean, there can always be more attention on that issue, but I think, yeah, the BBC also did a good, to be patriotic, they did a good expose on G4S and the use of G4S in women's detention centres and the abuse of women at the hands of G4S. So, I think it is a global issue that it's definitely a big problem here as well. Yeah.
Okay, can we just get and then here and then.
Sorry, amazing video. Just my name is Ismail and I'm from Central Asia, especially Kyrgyz Republic. I know that the same problem we have in Central Asia, but I have two questions. The first one is that have you got any partnership from organizations like UN or anything, and if they want to help you, how would you spend the money? And the second question is, I see the problem is in education, right? I mean, in that country, people are not aware that they are doing it. They are kind of doing it, and everyone is okay. But in Central Asia, I know that it's like kidnapping. In order to sell the people, they before got to be stolen. For example, from let me say from Kazakhstan, girls and boys from the young age, they used to be stolen to another country like Kyrgyzstan or whatever, and then only then they become like a slaver, like really slaver. And what would you do in this case? Like, how would we react on that problem? It's the second question. Because in the video, in the movie, I have seen that it is it's okay, people know, but they are not aware that this is illegal.
Yeah, it's let's not also generalize. Not all of the Kuwaiti people are actually engaged in these kind of activities.
Yeah.
So the people who are part of this. But I think this is a question for Mustafa rather than for the journalists, because they're not activists in that.
I'd like to answer about the UN though after.
I mean,
I can do
you
that.
go ahead first.
Yeah. So the UN, as you saw, Amila Bula is the special rapporteur on modern slavery. She's in the documentary, and she comments about it being an online slave market. She's actually going to, and I'm going with her to Silicon Valley in a couple of weeks' time to present the film to representatives from the major tech companies. And our hope is that in response they will improve their mechanisms for kind of detecting and stopping this kind of thing from happening. And it also just adds to her kind of case studies of how the kafala system is failing people in the region.
Yeah, I mean, really just to back that up, to say that exposure is so key. So we saw in that documentary that when the camera was on, the Kuwaiti authorities, which are actually doing lots of really positive things, but it's the power of exposure is there. But I think one of the things to really stress is that it's not just trafficking, although that's really significant. And in trafficking, often what happens is part of the definition of trafficking is to deceive someone. So people are often looking for a better livelihood for themselves. There's not enough work where they are. There might be pressure from their families. It's quite common for young women. We see this quite a bit in the work we do, where their own family pressure them to go look for work, and they have no idea what's in store for them. These are people that have never left their village or their city, and they get very easily made vulnerable. But many people actually willingly want to go, and anyone virtually who travels overseas in this kind of situation, they have to pay very large fees, and that generally leaves them in a form of debt bondage, which makes it much easier to coerce them. And there have been studies that have shown that the market in this sort of trading of visas, of selling people, it's worth billions of dollars. So the challenge you've got is the corruption linked to, on the one hand, authorities, many countries have signed the human trafficking, anti-trafficking convention, other things like that, but the money that's being made, that often is tied to these states. I think a really key part of it is the exposure, but things like, public interest litigation, putting pressure on governments, and also I would say is thinking about, the shops that you go to, the restaurants that you go to, the cars that you drive in if you use Uber and these sorts of things. Who are these people that are involved in our economies and our lives that we're very dependent on? Where are they coming from? And just very lastly, very briefly, with Central Asia, we have possibly the Olympics happening in Japan this year. Well, Central Asia, Japan is a hub for Central Asian workers, and there are profound issues there. And yet, like we said about the UK, there isn't much talked about with Japan or South Korea, these sorts of things. So I think it is about that kind of exposure. And there's a number of amazing charities. There's the work the two filmmakers are doing right now. If you're interested, I encourage you to speak to them, to speak to charities here, because obviously there's a lot more work that we need to do.
Yeah. No, we had, in the back, yes, please. And then here, and then.
Hi, thank you for the film. My name's Charlotte, I'm a journalist. Two quick questions. One, what was the reaction in Kuwait to the film? And secondly, the day after it came out, I was looking up the hashtag on Instagram and found a bunch of different accounts. Mainly they seem to be in Saudi, not in Kuwait. I just had a look now as well, again on Instagram, and same thing. Mainly seem to be Saudi-based kind of offices. Still lots of kind of photos up with people. I just wondered what you make of that.
So Instagram seemed to take down the specific accounts and hashtags that we alerted them to, but they don't seem to have done any wider work around the issue. So taking down accounts that have gone up since then, they're still there, as you saw. I did a quick search on Twitter today, and I found plenty of ads, also mostly from Saudi Arabia. So I mean, it's not something that our film can make some ripples straight after, but it really does rely on these tech companies genuinely taking responsibility. They can't just react when we kind of expose something. It needs to be more long term. And in terms of Kuwait, they were actually they engaged with us pretty well. Like when the film came out, we had them on a few of our BBC Arabic chat shows. They did something a bit weird though, which was to close down a lot of offices and claim that these people selling domestic workers were kind of expats. So blaming the online trade on non-Kuwaitis, which is obviously not what we saw in the film at all. But I mean, it was basically a much more positive reaction we expected to find from then. We'd filmed like illegally in their country, so we were kind of thinking that our friend who'd been meeting with us and kind of helping to find the girl, we were expecting him to kind of be furious with us, but it was a kind of there was a kind of understanding there that we had shown that Kuwait had good laws in place, and that there were just issues with how they're enforced and with culture, people's attitudes towards domestic workers.
Yeah, the Saudis also made a statement in response to our film, even though we didn't really focus on them as much. But their Human Rights Office made a statement just saying they condemn the online selling of domestic workers and that it's an illegal practice. But yeah, again, it's still very much prevalent there, so I don't know how much follow-up has been done.
No? Okay.
Yeah.
We have one question here.
Great talk and fascinating insights, guys. Thanks. This is possibly a question directed more to you, Mustafa. But you mentioned that the Kuwaiti government is making some positive changes with regards to social, cultural change and people's attitudes towards slavery or how they treat domestic workers. Can you shed some light on that?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of things that are happening generally in the Gulf. I mean, so when we talk about Kafala, the key things that are being looked at is, for example, it used to be that you needed to get an exit permit to leave the country as any kind of foreign worker, so whether you're high paid or low paid, and they've removed that. There's now a law that seeks to regulate domestic work, so that they're meant to have one day off. There are ways in which they're meant to be allowed to register a complaint. They're meant to have their passport on them. But not just domestic workers, so generally other categories of workers now being allowed those kinds of freedoms. And also there's been some initiatives, not just by the government, but by the parliament, by civil society. There's a sort of a nascent civil society in Kuwait around educating the society around migrant workers, challenging racism. There's also, again, nascent, but there's a sort of like a feminist movement in Kuwait that's targeting not just domestic workers and female migrant workers, but also the rights of women in Kuwait. Kuwait is one of the few countries in the Gulf which has a relatively active and well-developed parliamentary system, which you don't really have in, say, Qatar and Saudi. You have nominal local government structures and forms of elections in all the Gulf countries, but they don't really, they're basically, dictatorships. Kuwait, in that sense, is a lot more free. But the point is that the Gulf states, like many states, have been very quick to pass laws, policies, procedures. Those are really positive, but it's the practice that is often very difficult to crack down. And, as you mentioned, they will often blame other foreigners for these ills, the managers, the people who are running companies, rather than trying to target their own population. So those reforms are there. They're really positive. Like any situation, it's not black or white. It is grey. At the same time, you will see a range of things passed into law, but enforcement is very poor. But also, the norms in the society are also very bad. So, we can talk about many Gulf countries, but speaking of Kuwait, I met with a prosecutor from Kuwait, himself a foreign national, who was talking about the levels of racism that he faced. And, we saw that a bit in the video as well. This thing about calling your worker giving them names, calling them animal. We recently did quite a big study on East African migration to the Gulf, and there seems to be, even amongst migrant workers, a classification that if you are sub-Saharan African, you're often the lowest of the low. The way you're treated is much worse than, say, if you're Arab-speaking or something else. So those reforms have happened. They're very positive. And, if this film was attempted in the UAE or Saudi Arabia, there's a good chance that the team would be in jail. In Kuwait, to its credit, although not too much credit, this was able to happen. And like you said, you were able to actually say, we've been filming without a permit in your own country. That's a positive. We have to accept that. But that's not good enough. If this is happening and your entire society is dependent on these people, we're literally talking about the children of people being raised by someone that's being treated like an animal. Well, passing laws are positive, but it's not enough. Much more needs to happen.
Hi, great film, really powerful. I'm interested in the comments, really, in the context of, dare I say it, Brexit and us becoming more of an isolationist nation and putting more restrictions on the movement of people. And so kind of coming at it from the opposite direction, do you see Kafala operating in this country, and sort of increasingly so because of the protections and the visas and things which are becoming more difficult? And therefore, do you see the prospect for trading of people on electronic platforms in the UK? And if not, make a film about it.
Well, all I will say on my side is it is happening. So whether they're using apps or not, WhatsApp, Signal, they're encrypted technologies that are being used by all sorts of organized crime. So if you look at the statistics, a huge percentage of anyone who comes from Vietnam with a low-wage job is likely being trafficked. Ukrainians who come to the UK via Poland, there's a high chance that they've been trafficked. If you look at many construction sites, if you look at car hand washers, I think statistically the highest percentage of likely trafficking victims. There's no question technology is being used in this, and there's a lot of organized crime, and there's a lot of money being made. So you're quite right. And I think, when you have government, whether it's the UK or any government, rhetorically trying to show that they're tough on migration, but economies are completely dependent on migration, then there are loopholes there because there is a demand and supply-demand. So people will take jobs. We see it all the time, I'm sure you guys do too, which is that you will talk to people, you'll sit them down and say, do not leave. It's a terrible experience. It's not worth it. People will still go because there is such a desperation to look for work in some places, in the world, where there is absolutely nothing, and the local governments as well don't really put much pressure. They in fact see their nationals as an export commodity. So rather than developing their own society, they go, well, you know what, we let these people leave, we can't get them a job, and we're also profiting from this trade.
It's a good point. What was the Guinean reaction to when you approached them about Fatou?
So when we went to the Ghanaian embassy, they were very annoyed that we were wasting their time, and they complained that all these girls, they come here willingly and then they go to the Ghanaian embassy just for a free flight home, and it was like Fatou was a complete nuisance to them, and they didn't take any role in helping her. And the circumstances of Fatou was trafficked. Her passport was faked. She paid a lot of money to her traffickers. Her only wages that she made were paid to them. And when she went back to Guinea, she was fearful that those traffickers, because she hadn't fulfilled the amount of, she'd paid 2 months, I think, whereas the total amount she owed to them was 4 months. So she was, fearful that they would come demanding more money, even though she had, no support back home. So
we have another layer of responsibility, which is the responsibility of
the home country.
Embassies of home countries actually looking after their own people. Any more questions? Yeah.
Just following directly on from that, you didn't really mention wages apart from that one time when you talked about the fact that she'd only been paid 2 months. Is there regulation of how much they're paid, and how is that regulated? If they don't get paid, are they allowed to seek redress? And just another quick question. You said that you talked to 57 people on the phone, and then we saw that the ones that you filmed were ones saying, they're not allowed a day off, and they're very nice and they keep quiet, they don't complain. Were there people you spoke to who said, no, of course they get a day off, or was it selective editing or for a better film, or was it?
Out of 57, we used the ILO indicators of forced labour. So we tried to ask questions that wouldn't alert suspicion, but that would show whether they were allowed a mobile phone, they were allowed outside the house, they were given a day off per week, they were allowed holiday, all these things. And we, put our data together, and only 1 out of those 57 had a clear run. And in every other, all the 56, there was at least one indicator that was, that was fulfilled. Most commonly the passport, very often, no day off, and then also literally not being allowed to leave the house. And what was your other question?
Wages.
Yeah.
So there is minimum wage legislation in Kuwait, but what we found is that the wages are very much determined by a kind of racial hierarchy. So Filipinos, because they have a much more, partly because they have a much more active embassy, but also because of the kind of perception of them as being maybe better workers in some way, there's a lot of racial prejudice that meant that they get generally better wages, whereas people from sub-Saharan Africa, as Mustafa was saying, are often treated much worse. So the minimum wage is set so low that it's pretty negligible. It's like 80 KD, which is about $200 roughly. I think that's right. A month, yeah. So it's really a tiny amount, and if they're paying for their basics themselves, which they often will be, it doesn't go very far. And yeah, it's all, and quite often those wages are withheld. It was rare that obviously the employers would tell us that, but on the occasions where our undercover team were able to speak with the workers themselves, the workers would have stories about not being paid on time or just not being paid at all, which is obviously another indicator of modern slavery.
Yeah. But in many cases, the wages would be agreed on before they actually arrive. So they would know that when they come, they will be paid this amount of money monthly.
I think that it's quite rare for, like if you saw with Fatou, she in her case, she didn't know that she was even going to Kuwait. She was just told that she was going to have a job as a nanny
in China.
In China. And then she arrived, and so I mean I think that is part of the issue, is actually the information that they get before they go, and like the briefing on what their rights are. The government should be taking responsibility to do that.
And it seems only to be the Philippines where they have a lot of information about where they're going. They have like a training course before they go, but it doesn't happen really in any of the other countries.
If I may just end with just a little bit more info about Fatou and the GoFund Fatou, and it's mainly for her education. If you can just shed a little bit of light on that.
So in the course of making the documentary, we met with a lawyer, Kimberly Motley, who works in the US and has previously worked in Iraq and Afghanistan, but she specialises in cases on modern slavery, and she wants to take on Fatou's case and to try and see if she can win any compensation, both from her former employers and from some of the app developers as well. So the kind of fundraiser started off partly off the back of that, but actually, we realised that one of the biggest priorities for the money that we've raised so far is to pay for Fatou's education now that she's back in the country, and she wants to participate in the legal case herself and be a part of it and be able to have a voice. So that's why we've set it up. You can find a link to it really easily if you would. It would go a long way if you could donate anything. I mean, her schooling is pretty minimal in cost. It being in Guinea, so whatever you can give will go a long way. If you go on Jess's Marie Claire article, is that the best way?
Or type in GoFundMe and
Fatou.
FTOU.
FATOU, yeah. But on the Marie Claire article on the online slave market, there's a link at the bottom.
Yeah, there's a link at the bottom of that. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. It's the film is an evidence of how much do we need good investigative journalism, and the way that can help actually improve our societies. Thank you.
Thank you.